Here's something nobody in Washington wants to admit. The Pentagon releases report after report about China's military buildup. Congress holds hearings about Chinese economic power. Intelligence agencies warn about Chinese technology. And every politician talks about the China challenge. They're concerned, genuinely concerned. But here's what they won't say out loud. Western governments created every single thing they're worried about, not accidentally, through a direct chain of cause and effect that anyone can trace. This isn't conspiracy, this is history. Documented history that your education system skipped because it makes Western governments look bad. You've watched China rise your entire adult life. When you were young, it was the sick man of Asia. Now it's the world's second largest economy with a military that makes the Pentagon nervous. That transformation wasn't random. It was a response, a calculated, multi-generational response to what Western powers did. And here's the uncomfortable part. Everything the West fears about China today traces directly back to actions Western governments took over the past 180 years. Let me show you the receipts. Open any newspaper. Turn on any news channel. The China concerns are everywhere. Military concerns. China now has the world's largest navy by ship count. They're building aircraft carriers, hypersonic missiles, military bases in the South China Sea. The Pentagon's 2023 report calls China the pacing challenge, military speak for the threat we measure ourselves against. Economic concerns. China produces nearly 30% of global manufacturing output. UN data, not Chinese claims. More than the US, Japan, and Germany combined. They're the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. American companies can't compete on cost. European industries are hollowing out. Technology concerns. Huawei, TikTok, AI, semiconductors, quantum computing. Every month brings new warnings about Chinese tech advancement. Washington banned Huawei, restricted chip exports, created entire task forces dedicated to winning the tech race. Influence concerns, Belt and Road Initiative, Confucius Institutes, port acquisitions, African infrastructure. The worry is China buying influence globally while Western power shrinks. Politicians call it the China challenge. Think tanks call it great power competition. Some call it a new Cold War. But here's what nobody asks in those hearings. Why did China build all this? Not how. That's easy. Hard work, planning, sacrifice. The question is why. What created the motivation? What drove a civilization to transform itself so completely in 70 years? The answer is uncomfortable. Because the answer is, Western governments created the conditions for every single one of these developments. Let me trace the causation. The Pentagon worries about China's military. Let me tell you what created it. October 1860. British and French troops march into Beijing. They reach the Summer Palace, 800 acres of gardens, temples, and art collections built over 150 years. Lord Elgin, the British commander, orders it burned. 3,500 British soldiers spend 3 days destroying it. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers stuffing their pockets with jade and gold before setting fires. French writer Victor Hugo called it two bandits. This wasn't the first invasion, it was the second. 20 years earlier, Britain fought the First Opium War. Why? Because China tried to stop British merchants from selling opium to Chinese citizens. Let me say that again. China tried to stop a drug epidemic, and Britain sent gunboats. The result? The Treaty of Nanking, still preserved in British archives, forced China to hand over Hong Kong and pay $21 million in silver. But Britain wanted more, so they found an excuse for a second war, burned the Summer Palace, and extracted more concessions. And it kept happening. 1900, the Boxer Rebellion. 8 nations, Britain, France, United States, Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, Austria-Hungary, invaded China together. 50,000 foreign troops occupied Beijing. They looted, they killed. German Kaiser Wilhelm II told his soldiers to act like Huns so that no Chinese will ever again dare to look cross-eyed at a German. The Boxer Protocol of 1901, the treaty that ended it, demanded 450 million taels of silver. That's roughly $333 million at the time. According to historian Diana Preston, that was over 1,300% of China's annual tax revenue. They had to pay it over 39 years, with interest. 1937 to 1945, Japan invaded. The Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731. Somewhere between 14 and 20 million Chinese civilians died. Western powers mostly watched. So when you see Chinese military buildup today, understand what created it. A century of invasions, foreign troops in their capital, palaces burned, territory seized, population massacred. Chinese leaders didn't forget. They took notes. Every Chinese child learns this history. It's called the Century of Humiliation, and it's not propaganda. It happened. Western archives confirm it. So China built a military with one purpose: never be invaded again. That's not paranoia. That's pattern recognition. Congress worries about China's economic power. Let me tell you what created it. When the Opium Wars ended, China wasn't just militarily defeated, it was economically gutted. British parliamentary records from the 1840s show the scale. Before the wars, China had a trade surplus with Britain. Silver flowed in. After, China was forced to accept opium imports, open ports to foreign trade on foreign terms, and grant extraterritorial rights, meaning foreigners in China weren't subject to Chinese law. The treaty ports weren't trade agreements. They were economic extraction zones. Shanghai, Canton, Tianjin. Foreign powers controlled customs revenue. Foreign companies operated tax-free. Chinese merchants competed with one hand tied behind their backs. For a century, China's economy served foreign interests. Here's what gets me. When Mao declared the People's Republic in 1949, China's GDP per capita was around $50. Not $50 per day, $50 per year. One of the poorest nations on Earth. So what happened next? China decided never be poor and weak again. Now here's where it gets ironic. The economic power that worries Washington? Western companies built it. In the 1980s and 1990s, American and European corporations moved manufacturing to China. Why? Cheaper labor, higher profits, quarterly earnings. Western governments encouraged this. Free trade agreements, WTO admission in 2001. You probably remember the debates about whether China would democratize once it got rich. Western companies transferred technology, trained workers, built factories, created supply chains. China was supposed to be the workshop, cheap labor making cheap goods. The plan was, they make, we profit, they stay dependent. That's not what happened. China studied every factory, learned every process, built their own capacity, moved up the value chain. First toys and textiles, then electronics, then cars, then high-speed rail, then smartphones. World Bank data, not Chinese government claims, shows China lifted 800 million people out of poverty between 1981 and 2015. 800 million. That's more than double the entire US population. GDP went from $191 billion in 1980 to $17.7 trillion in 2023. IMF numbers. That's a 92x increase. Western corporations got their quarterly profits. China got an industrial base. And now Congress holds hearings asking how China got so powerful. The answer is in the mirror. Washington worries about Chinese technology. Let me tell you what created it. 2018. The US banned American companies from selling components to ZTE, a Chinese tech firm. ZTE nearly collapsed. Then came Huawei. Chip restrictions, software bans, entity lists. The message was clear. China depends on Western technology, and that dependence is a leash. But here's what happened next, and this is where the unintended consequences kick in. China looked at those sanctions and saw 1840 all over again. Foreign powers using economic leverage to control China. The Opium Wars were fought because China tried to control what came into its borders. Now America was controlling what technology China could access. Same pattern, different century. So China made a decision: never be technologically controlled again. The Made in China 2025 plan isn't a secret. It's published policy. Self-sufficiency in semiconductors, AI, robotics, aerospace, electric vehicles, biotech. The goal is explicit. Don't depend on anyone who can cut you off. Western sanctions didn't stop Chinese tech development. They accelerated it. Before the Huawei ban, Chinese companies were happy buying American chips. Why reinvent the wheel? After the ban, massive investment in domestic semiconductor production, SMIC. Huawei designing its own chips. Government funding pouring into the industry. The restrictions created the urgency. Same pattern with software. Ban Google services, now China has its own ecosystem. WeChat, Alibaba, Baidu, 1 billion users who don't need Western platforms. Here's the thing about sanctions. They work in the short term. Long term, they teach your target to survive without you. Japan learned this in the 1980s. When America pressured Japan on semiconductors, Japan diversified. When America sanctioned Russia, Russia found other markets. When America restricted China, China built alternatives. Every restriction said, "You can't depend on us." China heard, "Don't depend on them ever again." The technology race Washington worries about, it was sparked by Washington's own policies. They created the urgency, they provided the motivation, and now they're worried about the result. Let's connect the dots. Because this isn't complicated, it's just uncomfortable. Concern number 1, China's military. Cause, a century of invasions, 2 opium wars, 8-nation alliance, Japanese occupation, foreign troops in their capital, palaces burned, millions dead. Result, never be invaded again. World's largest navy, nuclear arsenal, military that can project power. Concern number 2, China's economy. Cause, economic exploitation through unequal treaties, being the poorest nation on earth in 1949. Then Western corporations moving manufacturing there for cheap labor. Result, never be poor and weak again. World's manufacturing center, second largest economy, 800 million lifted from poverty. Concern number 3, China's technology. Cause, dependency weaponized through sanctions. ZTE nearly destroyed. Huawei banned. Chip restrictions. The lesson that foreign technology is a leash. Result: never be technologically controlled again. Massive domestic investment, self-sufficiency as national priority, indigenous tech ecosystem. Concern number 4, China's global influence. Cause, century of humiliation on the world stage, treated as inferior, carved up by foreign powers, no seat at the table. Result: never be disrespected again. Belt and Road, UN involvement, bilateral relationships with 120+ countries, alternative to Western-led institutions. See the pattern? Every concern traces back to an action. Western governments humiliated China, created determination. Exploited China, created economic drive. Sanctioned China, created self-sufficiency. Disrespected China, created the push for global status. This isn't justification, it's causation. Understanding why someone acts doesn't mean agreeing with how they act. But if you don't understand the why, you'll never predict the what. Here's what your government won't say in those congressional hearings. When they warn about Chinese military power, they don't mention that Western invasions created the motivation. When they complain about Chinese economic competition, they don't mention that Western corporations built the factories. When they panic about Chinese technology, they don't mention that Western sanctions accelerated the development. When they worry about Chinese global influence, they don't mention that Western humiliation created the drive. This isn't ancient history. Xi Jinping mentions the century of humiliation regularly. It's in textbooks, it's in movies, it's in the national consciousness. And here's what really matters. Chinese leadership explicitly frames current policy as answering that humiliation. The military, response to invasions. The economy, response to exploitation. The technology, response to dependence. The global push, response to disrespect. They say this publicly in their own documents. The China Dream, Xi's signature slogan, is explicitly about national rejuvenation. Rejuvenation from what? The century of humiliation, the period when Western and Japanese powers dominated China. Every major Chinese policy goal connects back to that period. Belt and Road, restoring China's historical position as center of Asian trade. Military modernization, ensuring 1900 never happens again. Tech independence, ensuring 2018 never happens again. This is documented. This is stated. This is obvious if you look. But looking would require admitting uncomfortable truths. And governments don't do that. You've watched this entire transformation with your own eyes. You watched Nixon land in Beijing in 1972, thinking America was bringing China into the modern world. You watched Tiananmen in 1989, thinking the party would fall. You watched Hong Kong's handover in 1997, watching the end of what Britain took in 1842. You watched the Beijing Olympics in 2008, those 2008 drummers announcing China was back. You've seen the whole arc, from sick man of Asia to second superpower. And now you understand what drove it. Western governments are concerned about China's military. The military built because of Western invasions. Concerned about China's economy. The economy built in response to Western exploitation. Concerned about China's technology. The technology built because of Western restrictions. Concerned about China's influence. The influence built because of Western humiliation. Every current concern traces back to actions Western governments took. They planted these seeds. They watered them with humiliation, exploitation, and exclusion for over a century. Understanding this doesn't eliminate concerns, it explains them. And explanation matters. Because if you don't understand why China acts the way it does, you can't predict what comes next. You can't make smart policy. You can't avoid the mistakes that created this situation. The question isn't whether China's rise is good or bad. That's for each person to decide. The question is, do Western governments understand the role they played in creating it? Based on those congressional hearings, based on those Pentagon reports, based on every China threat speech that ignores the last 180 years of history, the answer is no. They don't. Or worse, they do, and they just won't say it. Your grandchildren will live in a world shaped by this history, by actions taken before you were born, by consequences still unfolding. The least we can do is understand how we got here.